courtroom was alive with murmurs and whispers as people shuffled into their seats, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden floor. It was a typical day for Judge Harrison, a man known for his stern demeanor and biting remarks. He sat at his bench, adjusting his robes with an air of authority, scanning the room with disinterest. To him, most cases were mundane, and today seemed no different. Among the crowd sat Emily Dawson, her unassuming figure blending seamlessly with the other spectators. She wore a floral dress that looked like it had been picked out in haste, paired with a cardigan slightly too big for her frame. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, strands escaping here and there. If anyone noticed her, they likely dismissed her as just another ordinary person dragged into the legal system, perhaps a friend of the defendant or a curious passerby. When the bailiff called the case of State versus Carter to order, Emily stood up slowly, clutching her purse tightly. Her movements were hesitant, almost timid, as she made her way toward the witness stand. The sound of her shoes against the floor echoed softly, drawing a few glances but nothing more. As she took her seat, Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. There was something about her nervous demeanor that caught his attention, not because it intrigued him, but because it amused him. "Miss Dawson, is it?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Emily nodded meekly, avoiding direct eye contact. "Well then," he continued, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "let's hope you can keep up with the proceedings. This isn't exactly tea time, you know?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, though Emily didn't react. Instead, she clasped her hands together on her lap, giving the impression of someone overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Even the defense attorney glanced at her curiously, wondering if this mild-mannered woman would hold up under pressure. No one suspected that beneath her calm exterior lay a mind sharper than any blade. As the prosecution began its questioning, Emily answered each query with careful deliberation. Her voice trembled slightly, and she paused often, as though searching for the right words. This only fueled Judge Harrison's amusement. "Take your time, Ms. Dawson," he interjected at one point, his tone laced with mockery. "We wouldn't want to rush you." The gallery erupted in quiet laughter once again, but Emily simply smiled faintly, nodding as if grateful for his patience. What no one realized, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even the jury, was that every stutter, every pause, every glance around the room was calculated. Emily wasn't lost or intimidated. She was playing a role, feeding into their assumptions about her. And while everyone else saw a simple woman struggling to find her footing, what they failed to notice was the flicker of intelligence in her eyes, a spark that hinted at the storm brewing beneath the surface. The prosecution's attorney, a tall man with an air of confidence, began his questioning. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word as if addressing a child. "Ms. Dawson," he said, leaning on the podium with a smug smile, "can you tell us what you saw on the evening in question?" Emily hesitated for a moment, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost trembling. I think I saw someone near the alleyway," she murmured, pausing to glance at the judge as though seeking approval. Judge Harrison rolled his eyes dramatically, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, turning to the prosecutor, he added, "Perhaps we should draw her a diagram. Maybe some crayons would help clarify things." A few people in the gallery stifled laughs while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily, however, didn't seem fazed. She simply nodded and replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." The prosecutor pressed on, clearly enjoying the dynamic. "And did this person, this shadowy figure, do anything unusual?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if deep in thought. "Well," she began, her voice still hesitant, "they were moving quickly, like they wanted to stay hidden." The prosecutor smirked, glancing at the jury as if to say, "See? Nothing concrete here. But just as he prepared to move on, Emily added quietly, "Though now that I think about it, they dropped something. A receipt, maybe?" This detail caught the defense attorney's attention. Leaning forward, he scribbled a note, his curiosity piqued. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "A receipt?" he repeated incredulously. "Are we seriously basing testimony on scraps of paper now? Perhaps next we'll be discussing tea leaves or fortune cookies." His remark drew more chuckles from the audience, but Emily merely smiled faintly, nodding again as if agreeing with him. Despite the mockery, Emily continued answering questions, sprinkling subtle hints into her responses. When asked about the lighting in the alley, she mentioned how the flickering street lamp created shadows that distorted shapes, a seemingly innocent observation that planted doubt about the clarity of other witnesses' accounts. Later, when questioned about timing, she casually pointed out discrepancies between her recollection and earlier testimonies, all while maintaining her meek demeanor. The prosecution grew increasingly frustrated, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Yet every time they tried to pin her down, Emily deflected with polite uncertainty. "I'm sorry if I'm not making sense," she said at one point, her cheeks flushing pink. It happened so fast." Judge Harrison waved a hand dismissively. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Let's move along before we lose another hour deciphering riddles." But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in the courtroom's facade. The defense attorney watched Emily closely, noticing the precision in her vague answers and the way she subtly undermined the prosecution's narrative. Even the jury, initially swayed by the prosecutor's confident delivery, started exchanging thoughtful glances. Something about Emily's words lingered in the air, planting seeds of doubt where none had existed before. As the cross-examination dragged on, Judge Harrison's irritation became palpable. He tapped his gavel impatiently, glaring at Emily as though willing her to trip up. But she never did. Instead, she remained composed, her unassuming presence masking a quiet determination. And though no one realized it yet, the tide was slowly turning, not because of grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but because of the steady, calculated unraveling of assumptions. The simple woman sitting in the witness chair was far more than she appeared, and the courtroom was about to find out just how wrong they'd been. As the prosecution wrapped up their questioning, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted ever so slightly. The defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Mr. Grayson, rose from his seat with a calm confidence that contrasted sharply with Emily's timid demeanor. He approached the podium, adjusting his tie before addressing her with a warm smile. "Ms. Dawson," he began, his voice steady and reassuring, "thank you for being here today. I know this must be difficult for you." Emily nodded shyly, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap. "It is," she admitted softly, glancing down at her fingers as if gathering courage. But when she looked up again, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something sharp and calculating, though fleeting enough to go unnoticed by most. Grayson started with simple questions, allowing Emily to recount her version of events without pressure. At first, her answers remained hesitant, much like they had during the prosecution's examination. However, as the line of questioning progressed, her tone began to change subtly. When asked about the alleyway lighting, she paused thoughtfully, before replying, "Yes, the light was poor but not completely dark. I could see shapes, movements, but details were hard to make out." Her words carried an undertone of certainty that hadn't been there before. The shift became more pronounced when Grayson delved deeper into inconsistencies between Emily's account and earlier testimonies. "You mentioned seeing someone drop an item, a receipt perhaps?" he prompted gently. Emily tilted her head, her expression one of careful consideration. "That's right," she said, her voice firmer now. "But it wasn't just any receipt. It had a logo on it, a logo that didn't match the business near the alley." This revelation caused a stir among the jury members, who exchanged puzzled looks. Even Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing. Sensing an opportunity, Grayson pressed further. And how can you be sure of that, Ms. Dawson? Did you pick it up? Emily hesitated, her nervousness returning, but this time it felt deliberate. I didn't pick it up, she admitted, lowering her gaze. But I remember thinking it was strange because the logo belonged to a coffee shop miles away from where we are now. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her statement sinking in. What had seemed like a vague recollection moments earlier suddenly took on new significance. Judge Harrison, visibly irritated by the turn of events, interrupted with a scoff. Are we really basing our case on a blurry memory of a logo? He demanded, his voice dripping with skepticism. This isn't a detective novel, folks. Let's stick to facts. But Emily surprised everyone by responding directly, her voice steady despite his condescension. With all due respect, Your Honor, memories aren't always clear-cut. Sometimes small details stand out precisely because everything else is unclear. Her remark drew murmurs of agreement from the gallery, and even some jurors nodded in acknowledgement. Judge Harrison, caught off guard, opened his mouth to retort, but thought better of it, settling instead for a dismissive wave of his hand. As the questioning continued, Emily grew bolder, weaving subtle contradictions into her narrative. She pointed out flaws in witness statements, highlighted procedural errors, and even questioned the reliability of evidence presented by the prosecution, all while maintaining her unassuming facade. Each word she spoke planted another seed of doubt, chipping away at the prosecution's carefully constructed case. By the time Grayson concluded his examination, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The once dismissive prosecutor now fidgeted, nervously, flipping through his notes as though searching for a way to counter Emily's unexpected brilliance. Judge Harrison, too, seemed uneasy, his earlier mockery replaced by a growing sense of unease. What no one realized, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even the spectators, was that Emily's transformation was intentional. Every stutter, every pause, every meek response had been a calculated move to lull them into complacency. And now, as the trial reached its tipping point, the woman they had underestimated was poised to reveal her true identity and shatter the illusion she had so masterfully created. The courtroom was tense as the defense attorney concluded his questioning, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and growing uncertainty. The prosecution looked flustered, flipping through their notes in search of a way to regain control. Judge Harrison, still trying to maintain his authoritative demeanor, leaned back in his chair with a scowl. He tapped his gavel lightly, ready to move on to closing arguments. But before he could speak, Emily stood up from the witness stand. Your Honor, she said softly, her voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. The entire room turned to look at her, surprised by her sudden initiative. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed but intrigued. Yes, Ms. Dawson, he asked, his tone laced with impatience. Do you have something to add? Emily took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box. For a moment she seemed unsure, almost vulnerable. Then, with deliberate slowness, she removed her glasses and set them down on the stand. She ran a hand through her hair, loosening the bun until her locks cascaded around her shoulders. The transformation was subtle yet striking. Her posture straightened, her expression grew confident, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence. I do, Your Honor, she replied, her voice now clear and commanding. But first, allow me to introduce myself properly. A murmur rippled through the gallery as everyone leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. My name isn't Emily Dawson, she continued, pausing for effect. It's Evelyn Harper. The name hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the spectators, and even the attorneys exchanged stunned glances. Evelyn Harper, the brilliant lawyer who had vanished years ago after exposing corruption within the justice system, was standing right in front of them. Judge Harrison's face turned pale, his gavel slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the bench. Evelyn didn't wait for the commotion to die down. Instead, she addressed the court directly, her words calm but powerful. I went undercover to investigate unethical practices in our legal system, she explained. This case is one of many examples where evidence has been manipulated and witnesses coerced, I chose to reveal myself today because the truth cannot remain hidden any longer." Her statement sent shockwaves through the room. The jury sat frozen, absorbing her every word, while the prosecutor frantically whispered to his assistant. Judge Harrison stammered, trying to regain control. This is highly irregular," he sputtered. "You can't just—" "I can, and I am," Evelyn interrupted, her tone firm but respectful. "Your Honor, you've mocked me, dismissed my testimony, and undermined my credibility, all because you assumed I was powerless. But let me assure you I am very much aware of the law, and I intend to use it to expose the injustice happening here." With that, Evelyn turned to the jury, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, this trial has been built on shaky foundations. Witness statements don't align, evidence has been tampered with, and key details have been conveniently overlooked. Today, I will prove beyond doubt that my client is innocent, and in doing so, I will shine a light on the flaws in our system that must be addressed." As Evelyn spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted completely. The initial disbelief gave way to awe, and even those who had doubted her earlier found themselves hanging on her every word. Judge Harrison, visibly shaken, struggled to process what was happening. His earlier mockery now felt hollow, a stark contrast to Evelyn's composed brilliance. By the time she finished speaking, the courtroom was electrified. Evelyn Harper had not only revealed her true identity, but also taken full command of the proceedings. What had started as a routine trial had transformed into something far greater, a battle for justice led by a woman who refused to be underestimated. And as Evelyn prepared to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The game had changed forever. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. All eyes were fixed on Evelyn Harper as she stepped down from the witness stand, her presence commanding attention. Gone was the timid woman who had entered the room hours earlier. In her place stood a force to be reckoned with, a lawyer whose reputation for brilliance had once inspired awe and fear alike. Judge Harrison, still reeling from the revelation, could only watch helplessly as Evelyn approached the defense table. With precision and confidence, Evelyn began dismantling the prosecution's case. She started by addressing the inconsistencies in witness testimonies, pointing out how their accounts contradicted not only each other, but also basic facts about the crime scene. "If we are to believe these statements," she said, gesturing toward the prosecutor's evidence board, "then my client somehow managed to be in two places at once. Does that sound plausible to you?" The jury exchanged glances, some nodding, slowly as they absorbed her argument. Next, Evelyn turned her focus to the physical evidence. Picking up a photograph of the alleged weapon, she held it up for everyone to see. "This knife," she explained, her voice calm but firm, "was found blocks away from the scene of the alleged crime. Yet, according to the prosecution, it is the smoking gun that ties my client to this case." Pausing for effect, she leaned closer to the jury box. "Let me ask you something. If you were guilty of committing a crime, would you leave behind such an obvious piece of evidence? Or would you take steps to ensure no trace of your involvement remained?" Her questions hung in the air, leaving the prosecution scrambling to respond. Their lead attorney stood up abruptly, attempting to object, but Judge Harrison, still visibly shaken, waved him off with a dismissive gesture. "Let her speak," he muttered under his breath, his usual arrogance replaced by unease. Evelyn pressed on, methodically exposing flaws in the investigation. She highlighted procedural errors, including improper handling of evidence and failure to document crucial details during witness interviews. "This isn't just sloppy work," she declared, turning to face the judge. "It's negligence. And when negligence occurs within our justice system, innocent people pay the price." As she spoke, Evelyn's passion became undeniable. Her words weren't just about winning the case, they were about holding the system accountable. She addressed the jury directly, appealing to their sense of fairness. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to look at the facts without bias or prejudice. Ask yourselves, has the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed this crime? Or have they simply relied on assumptions and circumstantial evidence? The impact of her arguments was palpable. Even the most skeptical jurors seemed swayed, their expressions softening as they considered her points. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison grew increasingly agitated, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his bench. He tried to interject several times, but Evelyn's composure never wavered. Every time he attempted to undermine her, she responded, with razor-sharp logic that left him speechless. Finally, Evelyn concluded her presentation with a powerful statement. "Justice isn't about convenience or shortcuts," she said, her voice resonating throughout the room. "It's about truth. And today, the truth demands that we acquit my client. Not because he's perfect, but because the burden of proof has not been met. Anything less than that would betray the very principles this court was built upon." When she finished speaking, the courtroom erupted into murmurs of approval. The prosecution team huddled together, frantically whispering among themselves, while Judge Harrison slumped back in his chair, defeated. Evelyn returned to her seat beside her client, her expression calm but resolute. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. The trial wasn't over yet, but one thing was clear. Evelyn Harper had turned the tide. What had begun as a mockery of justice was now a testament to the power of truth, and there was no stopping her now. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Evelyn Harper took her seat beside her client. The jury had been sent to deliberate, and now everyone waited anxiously for their verdict. Judge Harrison, still visibly rattled, tried to maintain an air of authority but failed miserably. His gavel lay forgotten on the bench, and his usual sharp commands were replaced by awkward silences. The once confident prosecutor paced nervously near his table, whispering hurriedly with his assistant, while the gallery buzzed with hushed conversations. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff entered the room and announced that the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom fell silent as the jurors filed back in, their faces unreadable. Evelyn sat calmly, her hands resting lightly on the defense table, exuding quiet confidence. Her client, a young man named Marcus Carter, gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. As the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, every eye in the room locked onto them. "We, the jury," the foreperson began, pausing briefly to glance at the judge before continuing, "find the defendant, Marcus Carter, not guilty." A wave of relief washed over Marcus as he slumped back in his chair, tears streaming down his face. Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. Cheers erupted from the gallery, though Judge Harrison quickly banged his gavel to restore order. But even he couldn't mask the weight of the moment. The system had worked, if only this time. Evelyn rose to address the court one final time. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "justice has prevailed today, but let us not forget the flaws that allowed this case to go this far. Innocent lives should never hang in the balance due to negligence or bias." She turned to the jury, offering them a respectful nod. "Thank you for upholding the principles of fairness and truth." Judge Harrison, pale and sweating, could only mutter a weak acknowledgement before declaring the session adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed Evelyn, eager to capture her reaction. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions flew from all directions. Yet Evelyn remained composed, deflecting attention away from herself and focusing instead on the broader implications of the case. "This isn't about me," she told the crowd firmly. "It's about ensuring that our justice system serves everyone equally regardless of wealth, status, or background. Today we saw accountability. Tomorrow we must demand reform." Her words resonated deeply, earning nods of approval from those who had witnessed the trial unfold. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison retreated to his chambers, his mind racing with dread. He knew his conduct during the trial would come under scrutiny, especially given Evelyn's reputation for exposing corruption. By the end of the week, news outlets were already reporting on his condescending remarks and procedural missteps, sparking calls for an investigation. Facing mounting pressure, Harrison submitted his resignation days later, citing unspecified health issues. It was a quiet exit for a man whose arrogance had finally caught up with him. For Marcus Carter, freedom tasted sweeter than anything he'd ever known. Surrounded by family and friends outside the courthouse, he thanked Evelyn profusely. "You saved my life," he said, his voice trembling with gratitude. Evelyn smiled gently, shaking her head. "No, Marcus," she replied. "You saved yourself by telling the truth. I just made sure people listened." As the sun set over the city, Evelyn walked away from the courthouse alone, blending into the evening crowd. Despite the media frenzy surrounding her return, she had no intention of resuming her high-profile career. Instead, she planned to continue working behind the scenes, mentoring young lawyers and advocating for systemic change. For Evelyn, this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice wasn't just an ideal but a reality worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed the trial, Evelyn Harper's name became synonymous with courage and integrity. News outlets couldn't get enough of her story, the brilliant attorney who had faked her death to expose corruption only to return triumphantly. In a courtroom showdown against one of the most arrogant judges in recent memory, documentaries were filmed, articles written, and talk shows clamored for interviews. Yet Evelyn remained elusive, refusing to bask in the spotlight or capitalize on her newfound fame. Instead, she focused her energy on mentoring young attorneys and advocating for reforms within the justice system. She rented a small office in a quiet part of town, far from the glitz and glamour of high-profile law firms. The sign outside read simply, "Harper Legal Advocacy Group." Inside, she worked tirelessly, guiding aspiring lawyers through the complexities of the legal world while emphasizing the importance of ethics and fairness. Her students often remarked how she could turn even the driest legal concepts into engaging lessons, weaving real-life examples into every discussion. One such student was Clara Bennett, a bright but struggling law graduate who had been on the verge of giving up before meeting Evelyn. "I used to think being a lawyer meant wearing expensive suits and arguing in fancy courtrooms," Clara recalled during an interview years later. "But Evelyn taught me it's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. She changed my life and my career." Evelyn also collaborated with community organizations to push for systemic changes. She drafted proposals addressing issues like witness tampering, evidence mishandling, and judicial misconduct, presenting them at conferences and legislative hearings. Though progress was slow, her persistence paid off. Several states adopted stricter guidelines for handling evidence, inspired by her recommendations. Judges began receiving mandatory training on impartiality, partly due to her advocacy. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison's resignation became a cautionary tale. An internal investigation revealed patterns of bias and misconduct stretching back decades. While no criminal charges were filed, his reputation lay in ruins. Former colleagues distanced themselves from him, and he faded into obscurity, living out his days in quiet shame. For many, his downfall served as a reminder that arrogance and prejudice have no place in the halls of justice. As for Marcus Carter, his acquittal marked a fresh start. With Evelyn's help, he secured a job at a local nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting wrongfully accused individuals. He became an outspoken advocate for reform himself, sharing his story at rallies and events. "Evelyn didn't just save me," Marcus often said. "She showed me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." Despite the accolades and admiration, Evelyn preferred to stay out of the limelight. She attended few public events and declined lucrative book deals or speaking engagements. When asked why, she simply smiled and said, "The work matters more than the recognition." Her humility endeared her to those who knew her personally, though it frustrated reporters desperate for an exclusive interview. By the end of the year, Evelyn's impact was undeniable. Law schools began incorporating her strategies into their curriculum, and awards were named in her honor. Yet she remained humble, always deflecting praise onto her team and mentees. To her, success wasn't measured by headlines or trophies. It was reflected in the lives she touched and the changes she inspired. Though Evelyn Harper had once disappeared to escape the flaws of the system, her return proved that one person could make a difference. Quietly, patiently, and without seeking glory, she reminded the world that justice isn't just a concept written in law books. It's a living, breathing ideal worth fighting for. And for everyone fortunate enough to cross her path, she left behind a legacy of hope, resilience, and unwavering determination. Years passed and Evelyn Harper's story became the stuff of legend. Law students pored over case studies about her dramatic courtroom reveal, dissecting every move she made during that fateful trial. Professors cited her as an example of brilliance, humility, and unwavering dedication to justice. Documentaries, titled The Woman Who Changed Justice, aired on television, captivating audiences with reenactments of her most memorable moments. Yet despite the public fascination, Evelyn herself remained a mystery. A quiet figure who shunned fame but whose influence was felt everywhere. Her work inspired a new generation of lawyers, many of whom referred to themselves as Evelyn's protégé. These young attorneys carried her teachings into courtrooms across the country, challenging injustices and holding the system accountable. Clara Bennett, one of Evelyn's earliest mentees, went on to win several high-profile cases, each time crediting her mentor for instilling in her the courage to stand up for what was right. "She taught us that being a lawyer isn't about winning," Clara often said. "It's about making sure the truth comes out no matter how hard people try to bury it." Evelyn's advocacy also led to lasting reforms. State legislatures enacted laws requiring stricter oversight of evidence collection and handling, ensuring fewer wrongful convictions. Judicial conduct boards implemented mandatory training programs focused on impartiality and fairness, directly influenced by Evelyn's recommendations. Even law schools began offering courses dedicated to ethics and systemic accountability, fields Evelyn had championed throughout her career. Though she avoided the spotlight, Evelyn occasionally surfaced at legal conferences or community events, always drawing large crowds eager to hear her speak. When she did appear, she never boasted about her achievements. Instead, she used these opportunities to remind others of the work still left to be done. "Justice is a journey, not a destination," she would say, her voice steady and sincere. "We may take steps forward, but we must remain vigilant against those who seek to drag us backward." Judge Harrison's name, meanwhile, faded into obscurity, a stark contrast to Evelyn's enduring legacy. His resignation became a symbol of the consequences of arrogance and prejudice, often referenced in discussions about judicial ethics. Legal textbooks included his mistakes as cautionary examples, warning future judges of the dangers of underestimating anyone in their courtroom. For Marcus Carter, life after exoneration was filled with purpose. He traveled extensively, sharing his story at schools, prisons, and community centers. His message was simple yet powerful. Don't give up, even when the odds feel impossible. There are people like Evelyn Harper out there fighting for you. He stayed in touch with Evelyn, sending her updates on his advocacy work and thanking her repeatedly for believing in him when no one else did. As the years went by, Evelyn eventually retired from active mentoring, leaving her office to younger colleagues who shared her vision. She moved to a small cottage by the sea, where she spent her days reading, writing letters to former students, and walking along the shore. Though she stepped away from the public eye, her impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully know. To this day, whenever someone fights for justice against overwhelming odds or stands firm in the face of mockery and doubt, they're often compared to Evelyn Harper. Her name became more than just a historical footnote. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that true genius lies not in seeking glory, but in using one's gifts to lift others up. And while Evelyn herself preferred to stay in the background, her legacy lived on, in the hearts of those she inspired, in the reforms she sparked, and in the countless lives she changed forever.